Today in Reading Workshop, we're going to be thinking about how we can use different text structures to help us hold on to meaning when we read narrative nonfiction. So, I have a little story that I want to tell you guys about. A couple years ago, I went on a fishing trip with my husband, and we were deep sea fishing. And I'd been used to regular fishing, like in rivers and stuff, so I was trying to use these hooks that really weren't helping me catch anything out in the ocean. So one of the guides that was with us, who was an expert on deep sea fishing, told me that I have to use a different hook in order to help me catch fish when I was deep sea fishing. So right away I changed the hook to fit the fish and made my first catch, and then another. I learned a very important lesson that day. We can't just cast any old hook into any old water and expect to have a bucket of fish. We first have to recognize not only the type of water, but also the type of fish in that water, and then we choose the appropriate hook. So today we're going to be starting a new bend in our nonfiction reading. And you're probably thinking, why is Miss Stiles talking about fishes and hooks? But I've chosen my fishing story for a reason. Many readers sink into nonfiction texts without even thinking about the hook. They think, it's nonfiction. I know how to read nonfiction. But we don't read biographies or narrative nonfiction the same way that we read a newspaper. We don't read car manual instructions the same way we read books about toads and frogs. So today I want to teach you that just as fishermen use different hooks for different fish, readers use different ways of reading depending on if a nonfiction text is an expository text or a story kind of nonfiction, like our Ruby Bridges story, and we call this narrative nonfiction. Readers of nonfiction stories use their knowledge of how stories go to organize their understanding of the text. So we're going to rev up our minds for reading a new text, and we're going to start out by asking ourselves, what sort of text is this? So we're going to take a look at a text that we're going to be reading today on a web page. So let's take a look at this text together. Ezra Jack Keats biography. Take just a second to kind of scan over the text and think about what kind of text is this. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading a little bit of the text. And I want us to be thinking about what kind of a text is this. Benjamin Katz and Augusta Podgany were born in Warsaw, Poland. However, they did not meet until they were both immigrated to the United States. Continuing the Polish custom, their wedding was arranged by a matchmaker. After the marriage, the two settled in the Jewish quarter of Brooklyn, New York, in a two-family house at number 438 Vermont Street. Their third child, Jacob Ezra Katz, was born on March 11th, 1916. So let's pause here for just a second. And I want us to think, now that we've read a little bit, what sort of text is this? Go ahead and turn and tell someone, is this expository, or is this more of a narrative like story kind of nonfiction? If you said this is a narrative nonfiction, more of like a story kind of nonfiction, you're right. So this is not an expository nonfiction. It is not organized as categories of ideas. Instead, it is a story, a biography to be more precise. The truth is that many nonfiction texts are stories, so we'll be learning about how to read that sort of nonfiction for the next week or so. Here's the important thing. It really helps to reach for the storyline buried under the facts, and let that storyline carry you through the text. So we want to kind of draw on our knowledge about fiction reading to help us as we get ready to read narrative nonfiction. So when we read fiction, we know about noticing the character's traits. We also know about noticing what the main character's problems are. So we're going to be using those things to help us read narrative nonfiction. So let's read this text like we read Stone Fox. Instead of thinking about Willie, we'll be thinking about the main character of this text. You'll see I've chosen a text about a writer. After all, you guys are all writers too. Remember, you'll be reading a true story. It helps to read it as a story, which means thinking, what does the main character want? What gets in the way of him getting what he wants? Listen for that, and I'll be listening for that as well. At an early age, Jacob, known later to the world as Ezra Jack Keats, became interested in art. His mother encouraged Keats' talent, but his father seemed only to criticize Keats' ability. Working at Pete's coffee shop in Greenwich Village, Benjamin Katz knew how hard earning a living could be. He felt that his son could never really be successful as an artist. However, his father did purchase tubes of paint for Keats under the pretense of having traded bowls of soup to starving artists. If you don't think artists starve, well, let me tell you. One man came in the other day and swapped me a tube of paint for a bowl of soup. Keats did win the approval of his father when he was paid 25 cents for painting an advertisement for a local store at the age of 8. Finally, Ben thought his son might be able to earn a living with his art as a sign painter. When Benjamin Katz died on January 1935, Keats, on the day before his high school graduation, had to identify his father's body. For the first time he learned that his father had been proud of his work. In his Caldecott Medal speech in 1963, Keats shared the experience. I found myself staring deep into his secret feelings. There in his wallet were worn and tattered newspaper clippings of the notices of the awards I had won, my silent admirer and supplier. He had been torn between his dread of my leading a life of hardship and his real pride in my work. Although Keats won 3 scholarships to art school, he was unable to attend. He worked to support his family by day and took art classes at night when he could. In 1937, he secured a job with the Works Progress Administration, WPA, working as a mural painter. After 3 years' time, Keats moved on to work as a comic book illustrator. Then in 1942, Keats began work on the staff of Fawcett Publications, illustrating backgrounds for the Captain Marvel comic strip. On April 13, 1943, Keats entered the service of the United States Air Corps. Taking advantage of his skill as an artist, the Army trained him to design camouflage patterns. Keats was given an honorary discharge in 1945, and he returned to New York. Keats suffered a period of health problems and melancholy after his return home. 2 years after World War II, Jacob Keats legally changed his name to Ezra Jack Keats. This was most certainly a reaction to the anti-Semitic prejudices of the time. In 1954, Jubilant for Sure by Elizabeth Hubbard Lansing was published. The book, set in the mountains of Kentucky, was the first book Keats illustrated for children. Keats, in an unpublished autobiography, stated, "I didn't even ask to get into children's books." In the 11 years that followed, Keats illustrated 54 books. My Dog is Lost, co-authored by Pat Scher, was published in 1960 and was Keats' first attempt at authoring a children's book. The main character is a Puerto Rican boy named Juanito, who had lost his dog in New York and meets children from different sections of New York, such as Chinatown and Little Italy. Keats was innovative in his use of minority children as central characters. In the 2 years that followed, Keats worked on a book featuring a little boy named Peter. Peter was inspired by an article Keats had clipped from the Life magazine in 1940. Then began an experience that turned my life around, working on a book with a black kid as hero. None of the manuscripts I'd been illustrating featured any black kids, except for token blacks in the background. My book would have him there simply because he should have been there all along. Years before, I had cut from a magazine a strip of photos of a little black boy. I often put them on my studio walls before I'd begun to illustrate children's books. I just loved looking at him. This was the child who would be the hero of my book. The book featuring Peter the Snowy Day received the Caldecott Medal for the most distinguished picture book for children in 1963. Peter appears in 6 more books, growing from a small boy in The Snowy Day to adolescence in Pet Show. Keats authored and/or illustrated more than 85 books for children in 1980. He was awarded the University of Southern Mississippi Medallion for outstanding contributions in the field of children's literature. On May 6, 1983, Ezra Jack Keats died from a heart attack. Now that we've finished the story, draw on what you know about how stories tend to go to recap what the whole story is about to your partner. Pretend your partner has never heard the story about Ezra Jack Keats. Remember that all stories involve a character who wants something, encounters obstacles, then somehow gets past those obstacles. Go ahead and turn and talk with your partner. So as you get ready to go off to read today, remember to notice text structure and to decide if your nonfiction text is expository nonfiction, giving you categories and facts, Or is it narrative nonfiction, a biography, like the story of Ruby Bridges or the story we just read about Ezra Jack Keats? Use your knowledge of fiction reading and what you know about reading stories to help you with narrative nonfiction.